tomorrow, we find out the gender of our future. So, what we want to do is to vote by hand of what everyone thinks it's going to be. So you can vote for, it's going to be a boy or a girl. And so if you think it's going to be a girl, go ahead and raise your hand. Oh, snap. 5, 6, 7, 8, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 18, 19, 20, 21. Get in the back. All right, you think it's going to be a boy? Raise your hand. 2, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. All right, 21 and 13. We'll see which of you have been blessed by God giving you insight. But we find out tomorrow, and hopefully, if everything goes well, we'll be able to share it real soon. So, thanks for all your prayers with the help of the baby. Things are looking great. Additionally, a few of us will be gone next weekend to the marriage retreat. Just wanted to remind you guys of that. Ethan is going to be preaching. And so that is super exciting. And today, DJ is giving a lesson. And he has no nerves to get up here. At ICMC, he got up in front of all 1,300 of us and shared the way he wants to build God's church and how he wants to use it. So, comparatively, from 1,300 preaching to us 40, 45 today, he's ready to go. And so, with that, I'm going to pray, and then he can come on up and preach. Father, thank you so much again for all that you do. We thank you for your scriptures, the guide us, and open our hearts, and you can open up our hearts to really allow your word, allow the thoughts you give DJ to share with us, to really bring us to a spot of either inspiration, of conviction, desire to see you. Hello, everyone. Just your very kind words with me, and I'd like to clarify that I always spoke for about 15 seconds on stage at ICMC, so I was far from being a full time right now. But I appreciate the opportunity to learn and connect with those students. I appreciate all the interest sharing there, and yeah, it was a great time. So I'm just grateful for being able to have been blessed in order to learn and grow. But yeah, so in the past few weeks, we've been going through the sermon series, God's Victories in the Old Testament. So today, we'll be continuing out with a sermon titled God's Supremacy is No Opinion. Right. Now, everyone has opinions. For example, I love the opinion that Coke Zero tastes better than Coke. Many believe that music is the best. And ultimately, these types of opinions come down to more personal. But there are things out there that contradict what we know to be true. The opinion that one must have culture in order to have any sort of success. This is often used in the most powerful education. Or the obviously false idea that all religions are basically opposite one another. They just use a new name to worship the same God. It's like these aren't based in reality. And you can call the name of your God, and I will call the name of the Lord. God who answers by fire, he is God. Then the people said, what you say is good. Only people called to be set apart from the nations around them have been corrupted. Elijah's statement of how long will you waver between two opinions is key here because it describes their faith. They were going back and forth on what they believed, uncertain about what they thought to be true. They were wavering between their opinions of which God was the real one, turning away from the Lord and turning to false idols. They'd forgotten the truth that God was in control. The Israelites were like an Olympic athlete who lost their motivation. When devoted to training, they would stay close to God. But when distracted by other ideas, other temptations, they wouldn't train and would have no hope of maintaining the pace that would carry them to victory. Without their focus on God, they would soon fall away. To fight against the Israelites' lack of faith, Elijah proposes a test that would prove the definitive truth, one that will reveal the real God in control, whether that be Baal or God. As we'll see further, God comes out on top. But the fact that the Israelites' hearts weren't with God was a massive problem. By wavering between opinions, believing in multiple deities, the people were forgetting about God and turning their back on Him, turning on the one who brought them into the light. But people's opinions will never change the truth of God's Christ. Israelites were highly inconsistent in their faith. They'd forgotten what was true. If God were to sing them a song during this time, it would have sounded something like these ever so wise words from modern pop singer Katy Perry. You're hot and you're cold. You're yes and you're no. You're in and you're out. You're up and you're down. Much like the person Katy's songs described, the Israelites had no love for God. Do these lyrics describe your relationship with God? You won't need to turn there, but Matthew 6:24 reads, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. These words in the New Testament speak to the truth that even today we struggle to focus on serving God and God alone. Oftentimes, we begin to waver in our opinions of who should be Lord of our life. We can put other things above God in our hearts and become unfaithful like the Israelites. Nowadays, there are countless idols to turn to: our careers, our finances, what the culture around us says, to name a few. For me personally, I know I can struggle with putting people's opinions in our thoughts. I've always been a people pleaser, and I care way too much about whether or not I'm liked by those around me, leading to severe anxiety, insecurity, and doubts. And that's what we can come to expect when we don't put God first in our lives. Us interns recently had a discussion about Matthew 22:39, which tells us that the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbors yourself. There was some healthy back and forth on what loving yourself entails in the given context, but ultimately we came to the conclusion that following the scriptures means truly putting yourself behind everyone and everything. And yet we're often the first to put ourselves in number one. We take our flawed opinions of ourselves and put them above the truth of what God says us to be. A phrase we can hear a lot today is live your truth, a concept that says everyone has their own truth inside them, and they need only to dig inside themselves to find it. Such a phrase implies that each person's truth is different, that there is no one objective truth. This is, of course, false. It would be more accurate for us to say live your opinion. Elijah spoke tongue-in-cheek when he said the Israelites wavered between opinions. He knew that the different gods were not mere opinions, but rather truth and falsehoods. Those of us committed to life as a disciple should say the phrase live in God's truth instead. There cannot be any other truth we follow. Yeah. I briefly mentioned earlier about some of the dangers living to please people, but there's a wide variety of causes for not living under God's truth. For example, we can have shallow convictions. It's fine if I church tomorrow. Apathetic spirituality. I don't need to worry about my Bible. God will still be there for me anyways. I don't need to apologize for that brother or sister. They hurt me first. Ungodly relationships. I know I act differently around Christians. Or unrepentant hearts. I don't need to work on it. That's all right. This list is hardly exhaustive. There's a lot of areas we stumble in. The Bible is full of warning for exactly this reason. So I want to think of things to yourself. Are there any areas of your heart that concern you? Any places you feel yourself putting your opinions first? As followers of Christ, we must be indignant towards any hint of indecision in our lives, holding fast to God's word and avoiding wavering like the Israelites. This brings me to my next point, act with the fast. Turning back to 1 Kings 18, you see how Elijah took action against the false prophets that were coming to Israel and turning the people away from God. Starting in verse 25, Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare first, since there are so many. Call on the name of your God." So they took the bull, gave it to them, and prepared it. Then they called the name of Baal from morning till noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response, no one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. The day passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar for the name of the Lord. He dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bones in pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars of water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it the 3rd time," he ordered, and they did it the 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Answer me, so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell, burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the dredge. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." Then Elijah commanded them to seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away. They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. Talk about an Old Testament victory, right? The absolute confidence that Elijah has in how God would work is inspirational. Elijah knew for a fact that the Lord was, and still is, the one true God. That God was with him at all times, not deep in thought, or busy, or traveling like he taunts the prophets with. And of course, God rewards the trust Elijah has in him with sending down fire to obliterate his altar. Elijah was a man with deep convictions about the truth, and nothing was going to stop him from doing the will of God. Despite significant opposition, Elijah was able to follow what God's commanded him to do in verses 1 through 2, and is rewarded for doing so with immediate and dramatic results. The false prophets were removed, and the Israelites were restored in their faith. He knew God was in control, and he had no fear when acting to bring his word to God. There are several ways that Elijah went above and beyond to make it known how supreme God was in comparison to Baal. For starters, verse 20 shows that people from around the entire country were present, leading to what was certainly enormous pressure on Elijah. He taunted the prophets of Baal, mocking their efforts, knowing full well what they were doing was in vain. Lastly, he upped the level of difficulty for his altar by flooding it with water, making it that much harder to ignite and burn. None of these were technically necessary, but all of these served to prove his point, that God's supremacy is a fact. Elijah takes this even further in verse 40, where he has the prophets of Baal taken and slaughtered, not just executed, but slaughtered. This may seem dramatic to us, but in the Old Testament Torah, there were clear outlines of how the Israelites were supposed to live their lives, and very serious punishments to turning away from God. Elijah followed God's commandments by removing those who insulted God by doing the one thing he hated most, worshiping false idols. Here, Elijah is like a surgeon removing a cancerous tumor from a patient, getting rid of everything that's corrupted the body of Israel in order to prevent it from growing back and causing more damage. Absolutely nothing can be spared, or else the danger will still be present. This is the same attitude we should have towards whatever causes us to waver, whatever leads to our lack of belief in God's truth. If we went back in time 20 years, with all the knowledge we have now, there's probably a lot of things we would do. Many of us would be taking the stock market pretty seriously. For example, if you were to purchase Apple stock in 2003, the money you would put in would be multiplied by roughly 662 nowadays. $10,000 then would become about 6.62 million nowadays. Most of us in position to do so would say that we would invest as much as we could. I wouldn't, as I was born in 2003 and will only be about 2 months old. But knowing the numbers that we do now, we probably wouldn't hesitate to do something with such a great reward. Typically, however, the stock market isn't something that we can put total trust in. So how much more confidence can we have in the works of the God of the universe? God will, and constantly does, exceed our expectations. We see in verse 38 that not only the wood will be, but the stones, ground, and water were burned up by God's answer to Elijah's prayer. He didn't just make his point, he proved beyond any shadow of a doubt to the Israelites that he was not second to some false idol. Many of us here tonight have seen him work similarly in our lives and the lives of those around us. But how often can we be tempted to waver, to turn away from the way, the truth, and the life in favor of what our hearts are telling us? Any idols we can have in our lives pale in comparison to God. They couldn't begin to stand up no matter how desperately we may believe in their power. Verse 29 describes it accurately. There was no response, no answer, no one paid attention. This is the result we can expect from living for idols. Absolutely nothing. We can have complete confidence in God's power, but no idols will give us anything that can satisfy. Think back to the list of idols I mentioned earlier. What did you connect with? And what would a life devoted to that lead to? For me and my people-pleasing nature, I would be devoted to others. I would lose any concept of who I am and be exactly like everyone else around me for fear of being judged or looked at as different. I wouldn't love God because I would love the world. This world does not love God. But because of the truth that's God's truth, I fight against that sinful nature. Living a life for the truth will lead to victory. Living for your opinion leads only to defeat. We're called to have a faith like Elijah's, to do what God calls us to do, no matter how terrifying it may seem. If we take action with the confidence that only His truth brings, we're sure to see victory, or at the very least, watch God's will unfold before us. We're still a fairly new church plant, but in the 2 years of us being here, so many of us have come to know and love God, and all that came from people acting faithfully in God's truth. If you had the same level of faith that Elijah did, how much of a difference for God's kingdom would you be able to make here in Flagstaff? As we start to wrap up tonight, I want to hit on a few final practicals that can help us to have a confidence in the truth that will last. If you're wanting to grow in your faith, or you feel like your heart is wavering in some way, take action. If you haven't gone through it already, our church has a Bible study series that helps people to develop their foundations of faith. Talk to someone such as myself, maybe Brian or Abby, who can help you get started and grow it. I know it's helped me tremendously to make my faith my own, and many of us in this group can attest to the same. If you have studied, I suggest being very intentional about sharing with others what you struggle in. Thursday night, Isaiah gave an excellent midweek on the importance of confessing your sins to others, and he made an excellent point about how staying quiet can be dangerous from Psalm 32. As members of the same body, we're called to lift one another up, but we can't do so if we're not fighting to be vulnerable with one another. Lastly, I want to encourage those of us who may be wavering with the reminder that God is faithful. Sometimes situations may arise that will test us, times when the hardships feel like too much to bear and the idols are far too tempting. But we see in 1 Corinthians 10 that God won't tempt us beyond what we can bear. Even if we're feeling overwhelmed with the burdens that life brings, we can have confidence that turning to Him is never impossible and will always be the correct decision. Come to God with the faith that only a life lived for Him can bring, and do not waver. God's impending victory is not an opinion, but a fact. Amen.